Hey there, my name's Jordan, and I'm a financial coach and financial planner. And today I'm your host at the Reimagine Wealth podcast, where we share imperfect stories about embodying our values, weaving just system level safety nets, and working to build the world that we want to live in. One where we all get to have our needs met and thrive. Let these be shared learnings that allow you to more deeply explore, experiment, and shift, and that allow us to unlock our collective knowledge. This show is ad-free and available to everyone, and it wouldn't be possible without your love and support. So if you like what you're listening to, please like, review, subscribe, and share the show with those in your community. If you're able, please support my work to produce the show by becoming a paid member of my Substack, which starts at $6 a month. Link to that and more is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. And now let's get into the show. In this episode, you are going to hear from Kevin Simowitz, who is a director at HouseUs, leading the development and grant-making strategies there, as well as a donor organizer and advisor. Throughout our conversation, some of the main themes that stand out are the ways that tenant organizing is a path to build collective power, as well as a path to build a bigger organizing tent. In our conversation, Kevin also calls in philanthropy to move beyond the spectrum of housing policy and affordable housing alone, but to really resource tenant organizing as a legitimate pathway towards housing justice and to contest for collective power. We also talk about the organization that Kevin is a part of, HouseUs, which is a pooled fund that's dedicated to supporting tenant organizing directly on the ground and building tenant power. If you are someone who wants to support tenant organizing, I encourage you to check out their website. It's linked in the show notes. Or if you are a tenant organizer, then I encourage you to also go to HouseUs's website because they have a lot of resources that can support you. Well, all right. I am so excited to have you here. Welcome, Kevin. Kevin, for usually guests on the show, I ask them to share your money story. And I know we're talking about your own story as well as the story of HouseUs and the need for tenant organizing. But I'm wondering if you could just share with listeners your own money story in the way that it's woven into the work that you're doing at HouseUs and just overall the work that you're doing within the world of tenant organizing.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Jordan. My money story may be different than some of the other guests I've heard, which is that I don't have much of a money story. Like I grew up in a family where there was no inherited money. And I wanted to bring that into the conversation because I've spent the past couple decades organizing on a variety of issues. But when I think about like tenant organizing and housing, and where that's connected to my own family's money story. Like my dad worked for a company that made sheet metal and my mom taught preschool. But like from as far back as I can remember, owning a house was like a goal that they had for me. And like the idea of home ownership as a form of like economic security, but also as a form of, I guess I would call it cultural capital, was like in my head from as far back as I can remember. And so even when I wasn't specifically working on issues related to housing, although as we're going to talk about, I think all the issues are related to housing, or even when I wasn't specifically working with tenant organizers, I had in my head, like often subconsciously, but I had in my head the idea that like for me, like home ownership means this particular thing. And I think part of what I'm interested in our work and also in this conversation is like, cool, how do we wrinkle that a little bit? Where does that come from? And what does that mean for us as individuals, but also as organizers?
Thank you. I really resonate with the home ownership means something. Like just thinking about, I'm in the millennial generation, like so many people striving to own a house, even if it might be, more than like the general rule of thumb of like 50% of their income, and just like the cultural capital, like you mentioned, as well as like what it means to be successful. Like home ownership is in that success narrative. And so I'm curious how that connected to you getting involved in the work that you're doing now, like as someone who, your parents were wanting you to have access to home ownership and kind of having that some degree of a safety net through homeownership. Can you share a little bit about kind of where you are now and what led you there?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm thinking about, okay, so now I am the director of HouseUs, which we'll get to talk a little bit about today, which is a pooled fund that supports tenant organizing all across the country. And then I have a couple other hats that I get to wear. One of the other hats that I wear is that I work with individual donors and families on redistribution plans and some of the conversations around like especially intergenerational wealth transfers and family giving. So I have another lens into that work. And then I'm really fortunate to get to work occasionally on other projects, especially when people are starting a new thing. So worth bringing into this conversation that I'm thinking mostly about like tenant organizing and housing justice through the lens of House Us, but that I also feel really lucky and honored that a bunch of individuals and families bring me into their own conversations about giving money away, which anytime someone is having a conversation about giving money away in the United States, that is almost always tied to the accumulation of wealth through real estate or property management or some combination therein. And so even if the conversation doesn't seem like it's going to be one about housing and tenant organizing when I start with a new client, it almost always finds its way pretty organically into the chat. And I'll just say as we start to get going, like the punchline of this story is not people who own their homes are bad. Like we're gonna have a conversation about systemic issues, and you can't shop your way out of this problem. Like we should question and interrogate what home ownership means, but we're interested in the systems and the policies here, not if someone bought their home, they should sell it and rent, and that will make things better for other people.
Yes, absolutely. And, speaking of the systemic issues, I have a sense that listeners kind of have an idea of the systemic issues, but I'd be curious to hear more in your own words and your own perspective, um, what you see those systemic issues as and how House Us is working to address them, particularly through the lens of tenant organizing. And I know one thing that really stood out to me about House Us is that y'all really focus and center poor BIPOC tenant leadership, and are in states where there's less tenant and cooperative power, where there's less. It's not like the West Coast or the East Coast necessarily, but it's in states that maybe are not as thought of as being progressive.
Yeah. There are so many ways we could spend our entire time kind of talking about the problem. As the folks at the homes, what used to be the Homes Guarantee, and is now the Tenant Union Federation, kind of famously said, like, one problem is that the rent is too damn high, right? So just at a basic level, most people in the country have a difficult time affording like a safe, permanent place for them, and in many cases for their family to live. There's like a bunch of diagnostics to run to ground about why that is, but at a sort of basic understanding level, wages haven't kept up with the cost of housing. And I think most of us probably know that. And especially over the past few years, as the profile of who owns housing in the United States has changed, the profit incentives, in fact, like some of these companies designing algorithms to help landlords illegally maximize profit, like, our ability to organize is struggling to catch up with those sorts of interventions. So housing is super expensive. It's getting more expensive, and that is true. We should talk about what this means for kind of our grant making and our footprint, but that's true everywhere in the country. I mean, it's not too long ago when I feel like these conversations took some form of New York's really expensive and LA's expensive, and like I have a friend in Boston and they have a really hard time. But, and then after that, but would fill in some version of, but you can move somewhere in the Midwest or the South or someplace where the rent is cheap, or you can buy a house for the amount that you're renting in Boston. That's not true anymore to the extent that that was ever true. There are places that are more and less expensive, but the unaffordability of housing, and that's rental housing and like homes for individuals to own, is like pretty significantly diminished from even like 5 or 10 years ago. So that's like the high level economics of it's really expensive, it's not getting cheaper, and once the rent goes up, it stays up. And then on the other side, there are, the problem that we are specifically trying to have an intervention around is the lack of recognized power of organized tenants. And so what we do at HouseUs is focus specifically on like that intervention. So, we could there are people who are focused on what would it look like to build more housing. That's great. That's helpful. Building more housing by itself does not solve for the problems that I just described. And like, who do you build for? Where is it built? What does it cost? How long is it going to cost that? These are all like the reason that we have to bring those challenges up is because, for decades, conversations that have been well intentioned at the coalition level around zoning reform and policies of that nature, like they get halfway there. But like we deeply believe that tenant organizing is a power proposition, not a policy proposition. And that without organized tenants moving in formation, and I really would love a chance to talk a little bit about like what that means to us, like that whatever policies we pass don't have like the implementation and enforcement teeth, but they also exist as just kind of floating policies rather than something that's grounded in a group of organized people. So like we're both trying to solve and intervene around like what's happening in the economy, but also we want to encourage especially our peers in philanthropy to stop thinking about this as like a policy issue and start thinking about it as a power issue so that we've got more money going to organized tenants.
I love that you're already getting to those points. I'm excited to dig a little deeper. And I do think there's kind of, even within the world of like, maybe there's a listener who has a family member that thinks this way, or people that are still kind of wrapping their heads around the concept of, why density or building more housing units doesn't get us out of this problem. So can you just speak to that and then like how that differs from like the power proposition of tenant organizing?
Yes, let's see if I can make it through without saying the A word.
You totally can.
I yeah, there are a couple ways to think about this. One is that the way that we have set up like new construction in the United States like involves some profit motive. And I can say value neutral on that question and just say that is a fact. And so for a developer to build new housing, if that's standalone single family housing or multi-unit housing or apartment buildings, like the way to make that break even is to either charge an amount of money where the developer is going to make this money back by renting the units or selling the building, or to backfill that with tax credits. That system has left us with like a massive gap in the amount of affordable housing that we need in the United States. And I'm going to, put sort of affordable in air quotes, even though I know it's an audio only format. But that means like deeply affordable housing all the way like beyond what might be characterized as affordable housing by like a HUD chart to like what we know needs to be affordable for people who are working multiple jobs and still can't find a place that they can rent. So yes, we definitely need to build more housing, who we build housing for and where it's built. And oftentimes those tax credits are tied to being at a certain rate of affordability for a certain number of years. And then once you're beyond those years, the owners of that property can increase the rent. It was like, we're in that stew. And so just building alone and just doing zoning reform alone doesn't actually answer this question if we're not also thinking about like what are the policies that protect the people who rent in those buildings, and importantly, what are the structures that allow those tenants to be on the same power plane as the people who own their buildings.
Thank you. I so appreciate it. It's connecting even very deeply for me locally. We just had an organizer come in and speak to one of our groups this weekend who was talking about like the promises that the city of Austin has made, which is it was like either 2,000 or 20,000, like to build, let's just say the lower number, 2,000 units in affordable housing in like the deeply affordable kind of like MFI category. And to date, this has been for 10 years. To date, we've gotten to 250 units. And it's just like because it's not profitable and our economy is centered on enclosing wealth and power. So I really appreciate you touching on that.
Yeah. And I think I know a little bit about, I don't know enough about Austin. I know a little bit about Austin. I live in Maine, so I've got plenty of Maine examples, but I bet you've got Austin examples of when some of that housing is proposed to be built and there's a town hall meeting or a city council meeting about that housing. I mean, the number of people who I didn't realize were massive parking advocates turn out in droves to sort of say, well, we can't build that here because what will that do to the parking? What will that do to the traffic? And I mean, there's plenty of ink spilled about the NIMBY movement, but like for me, what that always makes clear is like when we don't have an organized group of people advocating on the other side, and you're a developer, even if you're an affordable housing developer, trying to build 20 units of housing, and the entire city council meeting is opposed to it, we're not creating much incentive on the like community or the financial side for someone to build that. And so for me, that's like clearly an organizing challenge. And I think it's worth pointing out, since you like brought up the geography piece, like from my perspective, the worst of those meetings and like the nastiest comments come from some of the like bluest cities on the map. So, you know, the places that have like highest Democratic vote density are most vocally opposed to building any of this housing where they live. Like that's part of the problem too. And we can't just zoning reform our way out of that. That's where I really think we're in an organizing conversation. So I don't know if that's also part of what's happening in Austin, but it's like feels like it's part of what's happening everywhere.
Yes, and just like the racism like that's been embodied and how we've done housing as this is like from redlining and now to zoning, just different zoning that actually prevents different types of apartment units and different types of multi-home units. That's another challenge we're seeing here. We won't go super deep into it because I want to get into more of your work in the conversation, but just want to lift up that it's also so connected to racism and racialized capitalism. And so, Kevin, can you share a little bit more about in what ways can tenant organizing, and we're not going to tenant organize our way out of all of our systemic issues necessarily, but in what ways can tenant organizing be a strategy to build that power and to move towards having greater economic power when it comes to just like working class and poor people and just people across the country that are just trying to meet their basic needs?
It's a great question. Also, I realize I answer every question as though this is like part 1 of 7 in our podcast series. I'll like try to had to put the bumpers down on the bowling lane and really just stay in the middle. But I yeah, for almost everyone in the country, unless someone is extremely rich, the biggest bill that they pay each month is like their housing bill. So for most people, that's the rent. And so I'm a classically trained organizer. In fact, my computer is often propped up on a copy of the Midwest Academy chart. So it's like when I think about how do we reach people who are not otherwise reaching, I immediately go to material conditions, and the material condition that in my conversations locally, in my work through HouseUs, anywhere I go, one of the things that people are talking about is that they can't afford a place to live or that their rent is going up. And that's people who are already on all of our listservs and people who don't know that our listservs exist. Bless them, and everyone in between. And so following from that, one of the other things that happens in tenant organizing that I find extremely powerful is that because of the economics around like needing an affordable place to live, people are going to tenant union meetings who have never gone to any other organizing meeting. And I've spent for for folks who don't know, I spent most of my life working in like progressive multi-issue organizing groups, and I love those groups. I think they play an extremely important role. There are a lot of people coming to tenant union meetings who are never going to go to a chapter meetings of those groups, and that's totally fine because they play different roles. But some of the tenant union meetings, there are folks who have voted for one party their whole life, and that includes both of the major political parties in the US. There are people who've never voted, people who are excluded from voting by an unjust and racist system, and people who've never thought politics had anything to do with it. And they're all in the same room because the landlord said that the rent is going up $200. Like, that's real, and that's not happening in a whole lot of other places. And then one of the other things that is exceptionally powerful and challenging about tenant organizing is that you're organizing with the people with whom you live. And so, like, you're all, like, in most cases, like, you're in a building together. So there is, like, the political campaign piece. But then there's also the dynamics of, like, who plays their music a little louder than you might want them to play. And like, whose trash goes out a little bit too early. And it's like, those things are, it's amazing how often that comes up, like, in a way that, in my experience, never comes up in kind of other organizing settings. And in some ways, like, the tenant organizing conversations are also a way to, like, build and work through those sorts of things. Like, there's so many examples of instances where whatever was going on, maybe the default position of some of the tenants would be, we're going to call the police and have them intervene. And being a part of a tenant union is actually a chance to talk through, like, what do we need to keep each other safe that doesn't involve calling the police? And like, having, like, a space to have those conversations, like, fundamentally different from many of the other, like, organizing opportunities. I you Let me pause there and see, like, where you want to pick up. But, like, I think the only thing that I would tag that with, Jordan, is, like, when we're talking about building a tenant union, like an actual honest to goodness tenant union, not just in name, but in, we have more than 50% of the tenants in a particular building or property on cards. Like, let's say I was never great at math, so let's use easy numbers for us. Let's say there's 100 people in a building. That means that we need at least 51, but, like, really in organizing terms, that means we need 70. You're getting 70 out of 100 people to do the same thing. Like, that's almost an impossible task. Like, not just in politics, like in anything. Like, getting 70 out of 100 people to agree on, like, what's for lunch today is, and this is a big risk that we're asking people to take. Like, they're gonna publicly challenge their landlord in a power proposition. And so, unlike other forms of organizing, I don't mean to be critical of them. I just want to draw, like, a differentiator between what's happening in the tenant unions. You can't go find other people. Like, you either organize the people in that building and get a union, or you don't organize those people and you don't have enough collective power to take on the landlord. And so, like, you can't, again, it's one of those, you can't shop your way out of that problem. And it forces some of the, like, sharpest, deepest organizing that I see happening anywhere in the country right now. And I'm just like, yeah, remain in awe of the tenant member leaders and organizers who are doing that every day.
Yeah, I mean, it's what I'm really hearing you say is that it forces, like, true relationship building in a way that you can't get around, and that through that it actually lets people, like, maybe have conflict but also move through that conflict and build trust, and that is ultimately, like, what gets people sustained in this work.
Yeah.
If there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm just thinking about, like, some of the meetings where people come to a meeting and have never been in a setting where people say their pronouns when they go around and introduce themselves. Like, which feels like a real, like, microcosmic example. But if it's okay, I just want to bring it to the fore a little bit, because I think there is a school. I don't just think, I know, I spend some of my time on twitter.com. I know there is a school of thought that says, if we do things like treat everyone as, like, full humans in their identity, that we won't be able to expand the choir. We can't bring anyone in. And I just sort of live day to day in conversation with people who are proving that's not true. And that there are plenty of people who, in their first meeting, where people go around and introduce themselves with their pronouns are skeptical or confused or make a joke. I think most of us have had an experience of like being a little outside of our like what feels like the comfortable depth in the pool for us. And those are all sort of normal human reactions. And what I love about the tenant unions and the tenant organizing that's happening is that there are way like people are like brought into the conversation. And if they're a little skeptical or a little unsure, or even if they say, I'm not gonna do that, they're not kicked out of the tenant union. In fact, like they're a part of a thing that like has political education built and baked in, but also has what you described, Jordan, of like the relational work. So there are lines, right? But those lines are wide, and there's lots of room for like people who want to be a part of a thing, even if they're not quite sure what it looks like or what it means yet, to come in. That feels so much richer to me than you like either have to be with us on all these things or you can't come in, or like once you violate one of the things, you're out. Like, no, there are pathways like both in and out for people. And I remain really hopeful about what that means for like who can join, but also like who can become a leader in these tenant unions.
Absolutely. I think, and I hope that in other episodes this is coming through for listeners as well. But I think so much of if we want to actually shift the conditions to have a different economic system, we need to be building bridges and we need to be creating belonging amongst people that do not agree with us on everything and do not look like us or think like us on everything. And so I love that what you're touching on like really gets at the heart of that. It's like, okay, we all have a common problem or a common project, and that is one of the richest ways to actually move towards that without creating this in-group, out-group. And so you hold many different roles, which I think is makes this conversation very interesting. And I'm so curious to explore kind of that intersection between consolidated wealth or wealth hoarding, the symptom of housing being inaccessible in an economy that encloses wealth and power and that makes that housing inaccessible. In one of your memos, there's something that you said, and I'll just read it out loud. That housing is not an issue area. It is the area of contestation between organized people and consolidated capital. So, can you share more about this connection between housing accessibility and the connection to wealth hoarding?
Maybe centrally is the idea that owning property means that you get increased and in some cases unfettered access to like financial return because you own that property. Like either as a homeowner in the form of like all sorts of like tax advantaged like ways of being, or as a landlord in the form of like the rent that you're charging people. We should talk a little bit about what that means. But like at the core, the idea that if you own property, that you have like some amount of return coming to you just because you own that property. And in many cases, like owning property that someone else lives in and that's their home. Like there's a real central tension and challenge in that. And we live in the real world here at HouseUs. So it's like I am describing an end of capitalism. I don't know that we see that in our life, and that's not our like medium term political project. But like wrestling, I think first we have to wrestle with that contradiction for like the donor class especially. Like what does that mean? How has that allowed us to like consolidate enough money that we have some to give away? And how to start to pick apart like some of the myths that we've inherited, like the one I was describing at the top of our conversation about like what do I need and what does my family need and how does the economy work? Since those things often run like smack dab into the reality of like that is not compatible. Those things are not always compatible with like the idea of a powerfully organized group of tenants. Or the idea of a society where like everyone has access to like affordable housing. So I don't know if that's like a helpful starting point, but like that's the conversation that I think is really at the root of that contradiction that you're describing.
And just to pull on that thread a little bit more, like what would you want folks within the donor class or within more of the ruling class or even the upper middle class to be thinking about or taking in when it comes to acquiring property or yeah, I find so much cognitive dissonance in the like, I want to purchase a home or access a home because that does provide a degree of a safety net and economic stability. And even with my clients, like that goes really against my values, or like, how do I think about that? And are there, yeah, just the grappling that comes with that. So I'm curious, like, what would be the big like messages or takeaways that you would want someone listening to the show that has access to wealth or to class privilege to hear?
I think one thing that comes up relatively regularly in conversations with people who have enough money to give away and who sort of care about like broadly the issue of housing is that the idea of supporting like tenant organizing is still like a degree or two away from where many of them have been. So it's like kind of stayed in this like policy advocacy space or in the like supply space. And again, those are not on the surface bad spaces to be in, but I think when they're disconnected from the conversation about power, we wind up missing what is for us kind of like the central piece of what's needed to move forward together. And so at a philanthropic level, like sort of moving this, and I think I said this earlier because I say this 6 times an hour, but like moving the conversation about housing like away from a policy conversation and into a power conversation and starting to really push donors and prospective donors to think about like tenants as being not just people who like suffer in the system, but authors of their own story. And who like have pretty incredible solutions to the challenges that they're facing, like because landlords are raising their rent. Like getting money into those formations of organized tenants, like almost a bare minimum of like, sure, you should support some like better zoning coalition work in your city. And who's doing the work to organize tenants? One of the other things that we feel really lucky to be a part of at HouseUs is like a new project to help organize landlords and developers who it's called the Fairhaven Alliance. And we're just in the early days of this in partnership with some colleagues, but the idea being that if you're a landlord who wants to figure out writing like a lease agreement that's really fair for your tenants, it can be hard to find out what to include in that. And if you go to your Google machine and you punch it in, kind of what you find is like the most extractive lease agreements possible. And the example that I often use is if you're hiring a property management company, like the property management companies like compete for business by promising to do like the least amount of repairs, like they want to spend the least amount of your money. And so one of the things that we've been talking about is like, what would it look like if we had a rubric to hire property management companies who were going to do the best repairs and the fastest and got the best like satisfaction reports from so creating some space, and this is also part of like the expanding the tent piece. We focus almost all of our time, money, and attention at HouseUs on like the questions of tenant organizing. And there are lots of people who own their homes in the country who are with us. There are people who own, 2, 4, 6 multi-unit buildings who are also with us. We want to provide both organizing containers and tools for those folks to be in organized formation, following the leadership of poor and working class tenants. But also, like, we just know, I mean, I just believe if we're not organizing people, somebody else is organizing them. And if you look out right now at the like professional associations that exist for landlords and like housing developers, like if we don't compete in that space, people either wind up there or they sort of wind up floating without any direction. And so those are just some of the ways that we're thinking this year about trying to expand our organizing tent, even beyond the strictly like tenant organizing focus that we've had.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing about that. And I would love just to give you a chance to talk a little bit more about just HouseUs and like how did HouseUs come into existence and related to the Fairhaven project, like what are the the big strategies, campaigns, like focus areas that y'all are prioritizing and trying to resource them in a way that they can win?
Yeah, House Us turns 5 years old this spring and was initially launched through a grant from the Ford Foundation, which was kind of their last, like, at the time, sort of official formal grant in the housing justice space. And so House Us like launched and grew out of that with three primary objectives. One was to get money to tenant organizing efforts. So, as I've chatted a lot about today, we really felt like there was a big gap of money that was going to other forms of like affordable housing work, and between that and very little money getting to tenant organizing projects. So from day one, the focus was getting money to people who were organizing tenants in their power and their identity as tenants. Secondly, if we can think back 5 years ago, we were noticing a real gap at the federal level of like a voice and a vehicle for organized tenants to exert power and pressure. So I always use the example of Build Back Better when we had kind of policy high watermarks on a lot of other like key progressive issues like climate, healthcare. You have versions of like a Green New Deal and Medicare for all, the Build Back Better conversation. Then on housing, was more money for vouchers, which is like a real classic way to tell me you've never talked to any poor tenants. But it's not bad necessarily, but it is fundamentally and functionally incomplete. And so a lot of our early couple years at House Us were in support of the federal homes guarantee campaign, which is, as I mentioned, is now sort of transitioned into the Tenant Union Federation. But during the Biden administration, really working alongside groups pushing and fighting for the best possible policy at the federal level that worked for and centered tenants. And then our third goal at House Us from the beginning, which remains a goal, is to try to organize within philanthropy, which is not always the thing that I thought I was going to be doing. But both for institutional philanthropy and kind of individual and family donors, moving folks along the spectrum from affordable housing to housing justice, and then from housing justice to tenant power, and then sharpening the understanding of tenant union as like a coherent and cogent way to wield tenant power, like moving along that spectrum and finding ways for people to plug in. Since, in my experience, very few funders on the institutional or individual side, like kind of have a like housing portfolio, and that's fine. I think the work that our grantees do lives in the organizing portfolio, in the power portfolio, in the like, how do we bend the arc portfolio? And so helping people just get a better chance to experience and understand what's happening on the ground by tenant organizers. Those three things have shifted a little bit as we've grown, as our reach has expanded, but they kind of remain the fundamental pillars of what we're trying to do at House Us.
Yeah, and something that feels really key to both the vision and like why House Us exists is the role in supporting movements at pivotal moments in their development and growth, and not just like winning now, but having a sustainable foundation, durable organization, and supporting that leadership so that it's not just a in the now moment, but even 10 years from now, we're like, hell yeah, we're still here and still fighting. So anything that you want to share in regards to that?
Yes, thank you. Right. So many of our grantees are tenant unions that grow out of like a particular moment or a particular fight. And so one thing that I love about like the directors and the leadership of our tenant unions is like none of them, I think I can say none of them dreamed of being the executive director of a nonprofit, right? These are organizers who are like fighting landlords, which is great. But then at some point, like when the work moves beyond one campaign into a conversation about how do we make this like lasting and durable, we all know there's just a set of things that need to happen in that moment, and there's not a lot of support for new organizations. So, we're pretty proud and feel pretty lucky to very often be like the first funder of a lot of the work that we support, and put a we really prioritize trying to figure out moving money to groups where other funders might not quite feel ready to do that. But then we also know that beyond money, there's a bunch of things that people need. So I think sometimes about like, what are all the things that I wish someone had told me 14 years ago that could happen? And there's a bunch of stuff in that list for us, Jordan. I mean, we call it the omelet bar at HouseUs that's like available to our grantees because for a while I was just telling people like, let me know what I can do to be helpful. And then no one would ever like reach back out. I'm like, right. It took me longer than I like to admit to realize, like, yeah, I'm just like this Zoom square on their screen. They have no idea really what to ask me for. It's just this random person who's like kind of connected to this fund. And so we thought about like when you go to like breakfast at the hotel, they don't say, what do you want in the omelet? They give you a little card with all the ingredients that they have, and you check the card off what you want, and then you get the omelet with those things in it. And so we built and Martha on our team really built this Google form that is the omelet bar that grantees have access to that allows them to check off what they need. And that includes a bunch of things. Like if people need policy assistance to try to figure out who owns the buildings that they're organizing, that's the thing that we can connect them to. In many cases, executive directors have asked for some coaching support since it's their first time leading or running an organization, or sometimes they're managing people that they used to be in like a non-hierarchical organization with, and now they've got supervisory responsibilities. That's hard. There's also a bunch of things you have to do when you're running an org that, at least in my experience, nobody really teaches you. Like, how do you write a budget? Like, that's kind of that. And rather than just have you YouTubing all day to try to figure out how to do this, we want to connect you to like how to write a budget in a way that makes sense for the tenant organizing work that you're doing. And then that omelet bar scales all the way up to providing resources for tenant organizers who maybe work in one particular type of geography who want to go experience tenant organizing work in another place. So you alluded to this earlier, but we support work in rural communities and in cities and in every place in between. And so we want to have people like doing that cross training work and being able to like travel and like meet other tenant organizers and member leaders, but also see what's the same and what's different in another city, state, or political context. And so that work has both helped connect those tenant organizing projects to each other, but also helped people sort of turn from that first like, okay, we're doing a thing into how can we be around long enough to do lots more things together in the future.
I love that. I also really, really like that analogy. So thank you. And to extend the analogy a little bit further, I think a lot of folks listening like really care about supporting work that actually addresses creating economic power, building collective power, and getting us out of this extractive, like commodified housing system. And so I'm curious, when you think about the ingredients that you would want to see in an omelet bar, like how would you want people to be supporting HouseUs or the work of, whether it's in HouseUs or outside of HouseUs, just the work of tenant organizing?
I think from jump, I'll say, especially for individual donors and family foundations that are trying to figure out what to do, if you need help getting connected to a rigorous tenant organizing project, like we want to help you direct your money like directly to the tenant organizing work that is happening. We at HouseUs play, I think, a useful and important intermediary role to help move money across an entire like field of practice, and then also support all those things in the omelet bar that none of our grantees would be able to afford on their own, and that play an important purpose in helping like work alongside and create the cocoon for like tenant organizing to like really grow and thrive. Like we are always raising money, but we move out all the money that we raise each year. So we really want to be a model of like what that pooled fund can be. But I will always say in this conversation, the first thing that we want you to do is directly fund tenant organizing. You can do that through HouseUs, but if you're doing that through HouseUs, you're going to hear from me to make those aligned gifts directly to the tenant unions in the areas where you're able to. And then we're continuing to build out experiments that, like one in particular, which we are calling the Fire Your Landlord Fund, which like adds an additional dynamic to this conversation, because we want to think about the moments where tenant unions and tenant organizers have won campaigns against a landlord and forced the sale of a building by a bad landlord. And what we see too often is that the only people in a position to purchase that building are other landlords or people with already accumulated capital. And sometimes that works, but oftentimes we kind of wind up in a spot where we're going to have to run a similar type campaign in 1 or 2 or 3 years against that new landlord. And part of the challenge in front of us that we're trying to solve for is, what does it look like to have that money available to be able to purchase a building in a moment where a building is for sale and get it off the commodified market, and have kind of the tools available for that building to then be like community controlled and owned and run by the tenants in that building. That is truly a part two conversation. There's so much to dig into there, and there's so many people working like with HouseUs and alongside us right now to develop the idea, the mechanics, a lot of the how do you make this happen. But it feels extremely promising as a like in both lanes of my work. Like, it comes up in almost every conversation with donors about, I don't want my money like actively invested in the things that are opposing the stuff that I am trying to support with my grant making. I wish more institutional funders were there, but it's like really great to hear that from the individuals and the families. Like, I don't want my money like in an index fund where some of it's being managed by the same private equity firms that are buying up all this housing, and then I've like making these grants on the other side. So there's, I think, clearly demand for it. And there are way more tenant unions and tenant-led organizing projects, I think, even than I thought a year or two ago, that are exploring this idea, even if they're not calling it this exact thing, out of necessity. Because like until we get these properties like under our control, always figuring out like, well, like how do we have enough power to bargain with the landlord or with the owner? And so it's another tool that we want in the toolbox of like, what if we were the owner of those, not HouseUs, what if our like tenant-led organizations were the owner of those properties?
Ugh, absolutely. And it makes me think a lot about not only redistributing wealth, but redistributing power alongside
Yeah.
that. Like, I'm not your landlord, like you all are collectively stewarding, governing, owning this building. So I really appreciate that. I'll offer up one final question, just kind of wrapping up. Would love to make space for, anything else that you would want to share with listeners. Phrased another way, if you could wave a magic wand, what do you wish that people tuning in already knew about?
Well, first, let me say thanks for inviting this conversation. Truly, it's yeah, the time really flies when you're having fun, which for me means talking about tenant organizing and power. For you too, it seems. I'm not much of a fundraise by doom type person, but I do want to underline like some of what we're seeing, which is that there are two different ways where it really feels like the clock is ticking quickly. One is just on the kind of like economic side of this. Like, when we say the rent is too damn high, it's not just a slogan. Like, as the cost of housing continues to increase, I mean, I don't think I need to tell anybody who's listening. People who are squeezed are getting squeezed harder, and there's so many economic data points. And the like intersection of like housing and climate, and housing climate and the like the coming insurance crisis. Like, to me, as just an observer, but someone who observes pretty closely, it feels like we are in like when, not if, we're in another collapse moment, and like how well we are able to respond to that is like directly related to how well organized we are before that. So that's one piece. And the other is that HouseUs is a 501c3 fund, but I will say, as a political observer, a lot of this ground that used to live like just in conversations between Democrats of like, what should we do about affordable housing, is increasingly contested terrain. Like, the current vice president talks about like housing all the time. President Trump tweeted his version of preventing investors from owning single family homes a week or two. Like, these policy ideas are ones that like maybe started on the left and are now very much in contested political terrain. And we have to take that seriously. Like, we as like listeners and organizers and movement folks have to take that seriously, Because if we don't have solutions like on the scale of the problem that people are experiencing, it will be another issue that we sort of like lose any like authoritative ground on to be able to like talk to people in our base and also the people outside of our base who we think that we can bring in. That's happening like we described every day in the tenant union, but we also need that conversation to like take hold at the like donor level, at the policy level, at the political level too. Because if we don't get ahead, there are other people who have latched on to how salient this issue is for voters and for the electorate. And if we don't grab it, they will.
100%. Thank you, Kevin. I'm so grateful to have you on the show. And if you feel like sharing, because especially for folks who are looking for a donor advisor, or I guess both pathways, like how can folks get into contact you through the lens of HouseUs? And how can folks, if they're like, hey, I'm really looking for support and where I should be moving my money, or I'm looking for a donor advisor, how would you like them to get in touch?
That's nice. I'm easily findable, I think. But maybe in the show notes, I like houseus.org is the website, and there's an easy contact form to reach me. My personal website is just my name, Kevin Simwitz. People can find me there. And yeah, Jordan, if you'd be willing to include some links, people email and text, and I email and text back, and we go from there.
Wonderful. Thank you. That wraps us. Thank you so much for listening to the Reimagine Wealth podcast. You can find resources and links from today's episode in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, review, subscribe, and share this with those in your community. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a paid member of my Substack, which allows me to sustain this work and have more episodes to share in the future. Again, links to all of that and more are in the show notes. And until next time, I'm sending you resilience and warmth, and thank you so much for tuning in.